How does it feel to be a failure? Chad's voice cut through the candlelight like a blade, and for the first time in 15 years, I stopped pretending not to hear. The words hung over the table, too heavy to be laughed off, too sharp to be softened by the flicker of candles. Walter Hensley sat very still, his hand on the stem of a water glass, feeling the cool condensation slide between his fingers. He had heard worse in life, but rarely from someone who had eaten so well on his dime. His daughter Rachel stared down at her plate, the gold rim of the china gleaming in the light, a pattern he knew had been chosen on one of their splurge shopping trips. He had paid for that too, though no one here would mention it. Somewhere deep inside him, Evelyn's voice stirred, soft but insistent. You help her until she's stable, Walter, just until then. He had clung to those words for a decade and a half, turning them over like a stone in his pocket. But as he looked around this polished room at the crystal, the gleaming cabinetry, the wine Chad swirled like a connoisseur, it felt less like a promise and more like a shackle. The chapter's purpose was already taking shape in his mind. This would be the night the quiet ended. He was done being the silent benefactor, the unseen foundation beneath their marble countertops and designer light fixtures. Tonight would begin a change neither Rachel nor Chad saw coming. It was early spring in Brookhaven, that in-between time when the air carried a thin bite even after sundown. The dining room windows framed darkness, the faint glow of other homes down the street softened by budding trees. The room itself was warm, almost too warm, heavy with the scent of roasted meat and buttered vegetables. Every fork, every wine glass seemed staged for a magazine spread. Rachel had dressed the table like a hostess from one of those glossy home shows, her hair carefully smoothed, the silverware aligned like soldiers. Chad, in a pressed shirt and tie loosened just enough to look relaxed, sat at the head of the table. It was not lost on Walter that this was the chair he himself had once occupied during family gatherings, back when Evelyn was alive and laughter came easier. Now Chad presided as if he had built this life with his own hands. The dinner had begun with toasts. Rachel praised Chad's promotion to regional sales manager. Ethan and Lily, the grandchildren, recounted their day soccer practice, a piano lesson. Walter had listened, smiling faintly, though he couldn't help noting that the piano had been delivered only after he'd covered a 3-month shortfall in their mortgage. That memory was tucked away, like so many others, in the quiet vault of his mind. Chad refilled his glass from the Cabernet Walter had brought as a gift. Retirement must be nice, he said, swirling it under his nose. No pressure, no deadlines, no real responsibilities. His tone was light, but the edge was there, like a man testing how far he could lean before something broke. Walter set down his fork carefully, letting the prime rib cool on his plate. It has its moments, he said, watching Chad take another gulp. Don't get me wrong, Chad went on. You had a decent run as an engineer, but that was what, 40 years ago? Different world now. Everything's digital, fast-paced. Takes a younger mind to really succeed. Rachel shifted beside him, her silver bracelet catching the candlelight. Chad Dad had a wonderful career. He designed infrastructure that's still standing today. Chad waved this away. Sure, but let's be honest, when was the last time you actually built something? Accomplished something significant? From across the table, Lily looked up from her chicken. Grandpa built me a treehouse last summer. That's sweet, honey, Chad said, patting her head like a dog that had fetched a stick. But real men provide for their families through their own hard work. Not everyone can just coast through retirement while others carry the weight. The silence stretched, awkward and long. Rachel let out a nervous laugh. Maybe we should talk about something else. Lily, tell Grandpa about your piano recital. But Chad wasn't done. The wine had given him confidence, and the promotion had inflated him further. Now that I'm making real money, 6 figures, Walter, it might be time for everyone to start pulling their own weight. Take Rachel, for instance. She's been out of the workforce for years, living off—" He hesitated, smirked. "Let's call it family charity. Maybe it's time she rejoined the real world." Walter felt the words land like cold rain. 15 years of mortgage help, school tuition, car payments, medical bills. 15 years of covering their shortfalls while Chad poured money into image and indulgence. He glanced at Ethan, 12 years old, who looked between the adults with wide, uncertain eyes. "Are we in trouble, Dad?" the boy asked quietly. "No, son," Chad replied. "But it's important to understand the difference between earners and dependents, between providers and—" His gaze locked on Walter. "Those who have given up trying." The insult lingered in the air like smoke from a candle just snuffed out. Rachel reached for her wine with trembling fingers. Walter stayed still, feeling each beat of his heart, as if it were marking time for something larger than himself. "I don't mean to be harsh," Chad said, leaning forward, "but someone needs to ask the hard questions. When was the last time you contributed something meaningful? When did you last feel the satisfaction of earning your own way instead of just existing?" He paused, letting the silence hold, savoring what he thought was his moment of dominance. "How does it feel to be a failure?" Walter took a slow sip of water, set the glass down with precision, and met Chad's eyes. "How does it feel," he said evenly, "to know this failure will no longer be paying your bills?" Chad blinked. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan and Lily stared, the air in the room turning heavy and still. Walter rose, laying his napkin on the table. He kissed Lily's head, patted Ethan's shoulder. "Thank you for dinner, Rachel. It was delicious." And then he stepped into the March night, the cold air a relief after the stifling pretense inside. The drive home passed without music, without thought, only the quiet certainty of what he would do next. Inside his modest home, he hung his coat in the hall closet, walked into his study, and sat in the leather chair Evelyn had given him for their 20th anniversary. The room smelled of paper and polish. His fingers rested on the edge of the desk where years of bills and bank statements had been opened, reviewed, and paid. Tonight, those same hands would undo 15 years of habit. He let his mind replay the evening, not the insult itself, but Rachel's silence, Chad's smirk, and the children's confusion. He thought of the kitchen renovation he'd funded, the vacations he'd paid for, the private school uniforms folded neatly in their mudroom. The sum of all those quiet sacrifices was more than just money. It was years of his life spent making sure their lives were easy. The night pressed in around him. In the corner, the old clock ticked, steady and patient. Walter knew he would not sleep. There was work to be done, and for the first time in years, it was for himself. He rose, crossed the room to the filing cabinets, and ran his hand over the labels. Mortgage, auto, tuition, insurance, vacations, each one a history of generosity, a record of promises kept long past their due. Tomorrow those streams would dry up, and the current that had carried Rachel and Chad so effortlessly would turn into rapids they'd have to navigate on their own. The March wind rattled the window panes, but inside Walter felt a stillness he hadn't known in years. Somewhere between Chad's question and his own answer, the balance had shifted. They just didn't know it yet. I pushed my chair back, kissed my grandchildren goodnight, and walked out into the March cold, knowing exactly what I would do next. By the time I reached my study, the anger had settled into something colder precision. Walter closed the door behind him, shutting out the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, shutting out the restless churn in his own mind. The brass desk lamp clicked on with a warm, amber glow, spilling light across the mahogany surface. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, the kind of deep quiet only found in a home lived in alone. He lowered himself into the leather chair Evelyn had once teased him about, the captain's seat, where he plotted home projects and balanced the checkbook in their early years. Now, it would be his war table. For 15 years, those filing cabinets had been a quiet extension of his heart, a place where proof of his promise to Evelyn was kept in neat, labeled order. Mortgage assistance in blue folders, auto loans in green, tuition in yellow, insurance and medical bills in red, vacations and gifts tucked into plain manila envelopes. Every page was a story of stepping in, of making sure Rachel and Chad's lives stayed stitched together without the seams ever showing. Tonight, those same records would be the map for dismantling what he had built. The numbers had always mattered to Walter, not just for their value, but for their clarity. He reached into the cabinet labeled 2009 to 2012 and pulled the first stack of mortgage receipts. $2,800 every month from February 2009 onward. His old calculator clicked as his fingers worked. 2,800 times 180 months. $504,000 in mortgage payments alone. He sat back, letting that figure settle into the air like dust motes. One by one, the years unfolded. Car payments for Chad's leased BMW and Rachel's SUV, $450 here, $650 there, each withdrawal a quiet gift they never had to think about. He flipped through the school tuition receipts, pages thick with private academy letterheads. 4 years of Lily's schooling, 7 of Ethan's, each with fees for uniforms, sports leagues, music lessons. The sums were staggering, even to him. By the time he'd finished totaling medical bills, insurance premiums, vacation costs, and those quiet emergency payments that had patched one crisis or another, the final number stood stark and heavy. $976,200. Nearly $1 million, documented down to the penny. Walter leaned back, the leather creaking beneath him. He thought of Evelyn in her last weeks, her hand frail but firm in his. "She's your daughter, Walter. Promise me you'll look out for her." He had said yes, and he had meant it, but looking out for someone didn't mean keeping them from learning how to stand. Somewhere along the years, his promise had been twisted into a lifetime obligation, their gratitude worn away by habit. He reached for the phone. The first call was to First National Bank. A polite young woman named Jennifer answered, her tone bright but measured. "May I have your account number, sir?" He read it out, his voice steady. "I need to cancel automatic payments from my checking account ending in 156. There were verification questions, the soft clatter of a keyboard on her end. She had no idea that with each keystroke, she was unraveling 15 years of financial scaffolding. "Those payments are now discontinued, Mr. Hensley. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "No," Walter said. "That will do." Mortgage. Canceled. Next was Colorado Mountain Insurance. A supervisor was required to finalize the cancellation, her voice tinged with the mild suspicion of someone who had rarely heard a client refuse just one more month of coverage for your loved ones. Walter declined politely. The BMW lease took 3 transfers before he reached someone authorized to terminate the arrangement. He could picture Chad's face when the next statement came. The shock, the scramble. He did not gloat at the image, but neither did he shy from it. Each call was logged in his ledger, the dates and confirmation numbers written in his neat engineer's script. The process had the same calm rhythm as balancing an equation. As the afternoon light dimmed beyond his window, Walter moved to the most sensitive of all. Centura Academy's tuition payments. The school's bursar was brisk but courteous, noting the suddenness of the change. Will you be replacing this with another payment source? She asked. No, Walter replied. Not at this time. When the line disconnected, he sat back again, the hum of the desk lamp filling the silence. That cancellation, more than any other, would send the first real crack through the facade Rachel and Chad presented to the world. By the time the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9, 8 separate payments were gone. 8 lifelines cut clean. He set the pen down, flexing his hand. The air in the study seemed lighter, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Walter stood and crossed to the window, looking out over the quiet street. The porch lights of neighboring houses glowed warm in the cool March night, each one sheltering a family with its own burdens and triumphs. He wondered briefly what Rachel was doing at that moment, if Chad was still basking in his promotion, if they were laughing over another glass of wine, unaware of the shift beneath their feet. Not for long, he thought. He turned back to his desk, aligning the stack of receipts with practiced precision, then switched off the lamp. The house settled into darkness, the tick of the hallway clock marking each second until the first call would come. By 11:15 a.m. the next morning, 8 payments were gone, and he knew it would not take long for the first call to come. "Dad, something's wrong with our mortgage payment," Rachel said. "The bank says there's no money." Walter had been standing at his small kitchen counter, scooping grounds from an old tin into the paper filter when the phone rang. He let it buzz twice before answering. Habit made him polite. Resolve made him quiet. The kettle hissed. He could feel the ache in his shoulders from a long, sleepless night, but beneath the fatigue, a clear line had formed. He had drawn it himself. He heard the tightness in his daughter's voice, the kind that frayed whenever life wobbled out of comfort. A part of him, the father who had always stepped into storms, leaned forward. Another part, the man who had been mocked across polished mahogany, held firm. He set the kettle down and watched the steam curl upward like a ghost escaping. "What did the bank say exactly?" he asked. "They said there were insufficient funds in the account." She swallowed audibly. "But that does not make sense. That payment should be automatic." "That is true," he said, and pulled a chipped mug from the cupboard. "It should be automatic. It has been for years." Silence on the other end. He could hear, faintly, the clink of glassware, the distant shuffle of footsteps. Someone, Lily, probably asked from another room if she could have another waffle. "Dad," Rachel said, voice dropping to a whisper, "did something happen?" "I made a decision," he replied. He poured water over the grounds and listened to the first bloom of coffee. "I canceled the automatic payments." There was no sound at first, as if the word canceled had sucked the air out of her kitchen. Then came the breath, a small, startled exhale. "You what?" "I canceled the automatic payments," he repeated, steady and unhurried, as if describing a simple repair. "Mortgage, insurance, car leases, tuition." "Dad, you cannot be serious. We will get hit with penalties." "The bank." She stopped, searching for footing in a room whose furniture had shifted overnight. "Why would you do that without telling us?" He looked out the window to his narrow backyard. Frost clung to the edges of the bird bath. "I told you last night," he said, when Chad asked how it felt to be a failure. "That was uncalled for," Rachel said quickly. "He was showing off. He had too much wine." "He did not mean—" "He did," Walter murmured, and took the first sip. The coffee was strong and a little bitter. He found he welcomed the sting. "Dad," she said again, pleading now, "we have a routine. The school will expect the tuition. The mortgage is due today. Ethan has an activity fee this week, and Lily—" "The routine," he said, setting the mug down, "is the problem." She made a sound, then, a small crack that might have been the first fracture in a long facade. "We cannot do this without you." "You will have to," he said, not unkindly. "You and Chad will need to decide what you can afford. Uppy." There was a child's voice in the background, Ethan this time, asking if the bus was coming. Rachel exhaled again, the phone brushing fabric as she shifted. When she spoke, her words came out tight. "We will talk later." "We will," Walter said, and he ended the call before the instinct to soothe could betray him. He carried his coffee to the kitchen table and opened his ledger, running a thumb over last night's neat columns. Dates, company names, confirmation numbers, an engineer's trail through a family's private storm. The house felt still around him, the kind of quiet that comes after you tell a truth no one wants to hear. Not 15 minutes later, the phone lit up again. Chad. Walter let it ring through once, twice, 3 times, then answered. "Whatever game you are playing ends now," Chad said. The false warmth from the night before had burned off, leaving metal. "You call the bank, you call the school, you call whoever you need to call, and you restore every payment. Do you understand me? I am not playing games. You cannot just cut us off without warning. There are legal obligations, verbal contracts. You told Rachel, 'I promised Evelyn I would help until Rachel was stable,'" Walter said. 15 years should have been enough time to find stability. "You are being vindictive because your feelings were hurt," Chad snapped. "You are punishing us and punishing the children because you cannot handle being called out." Walter stared at the slow swirl of coffee in his cup. "I am refusing to finance a lie," he said. "You want to live a 6-figure lifestyle. You do not earn one." "You think you are better than me because you are old," Chad said, raising his voice, "because you did some blue-collar work once upon a time." "Engineering was never blue-collar," Walter said mildly, "and pride was never a retirement plan." On the line, Chad inhaled as if to launch another salvo. What came out instead was a strained, "We have a mortgage due today." Walter let the silence sit. He had learned long ago that silence was not a void, but a lever. "You will hear from our attorney," Chad said finally, and the line went dead. Walter did not put the phone down. He scrolled to the entry marked First National and checked the confirmation code against his notes. Verified. Mortgage auto pay terminated. He took another sip of coffee and turned the page. The morning passed in slow increments, laundry tumbling in the next room, a neighbor's car door thudding shut, the mail sliding through the slot in a soft shuffle. At 11:27, his phone buzzed with a notification from the utility company. Auto pay canceled. A minute later, an email from the Academy bursar acknowledged the change, effective immediately. By noon, Rachel called again. Her voice had lost its brittle edge. It trembled. "Dad, I talked to the school. They said our March payment was declined." "I know," he said. "The insurance informed us we are past due. The electric company, Dad, please. This is not funny." "I never joked about money," he said. "You know that." "This will destroy us," she whispered. "We will lose the house." He looked at his ledger, at the careful sum, at the small space he had left for notes after the final line, as if saving room for whatever meaning could be made of so many numbers. "You should have stood here with me years ago," he thought, and then he said, gently, "Then you will need to decide what you can afford to keep." She hung up without saying goodbye. He let the phone slide from his palm to the table and listened to it settle. In the early afternoon, he walked to the front window and pulled the curtain with 2 fingers. Across the street, Harold McCoy shuffled down the sidewalk in his brown jacket and baseball cap, the same outfit he wore for his daily circuits of the block. Harold paused at the Whitford's corner, bent as if to tie a shoe, and then straightened, peering toward their front door. A delivery van idled at the curb, The driver stepped out with a clipboard, spoke to someone inside, and left with a thin, stapled packet in his hand. Already the ripples had started. Walter let the curtain fall and went to the sink to rinse his cup. The water ran clear and cold. He stared at the stream and heard, faintly, Evelyn's laugh, the one that had warmed rooms. "You are doing the hard thing," she might have said. "It is still the right thing." By late afternoon, he needed air. He put on his jacket and walked the length of the block, nodding at Mrs. Langford as she pruned the spindly roses by her steps. "Cold one," she said. "Feels like winter is not ready to leave." "It rarely asks permission," he replied. At the next corner, he caught a glimpse of Rachel through the grocery store window on Main Street. She stood behind a register in a blue vest with a name tag he could not read from the sidewalk, scanning items with a practiced rhythm. A customer said something. Rachel smiled tightly and bagged a loaf of bread. He had not known she had applied. He felt the smallest stir of admiration beneath the grief. Work had a way of clarifying who you were. The bell on the grocery door jingled as a teenager came out with a soda. She brushed past him without looking up. Walter stood for another minute, just long enough to see Rachel look up and, through the glass, notice him. She did not stop what she was doing. He nodded once and kept walking. Back home, the phone was waiting with 2 voicemails. The first was from a leasing agent using a tone too bright for bad news, explaining that the payment for the BMW had not been received and late fees would apply. The second was from the Academy's accounting office, asking for an updated method of payment for Ethan and Lily's tuition. He wrote both numbers down and set the notepad aside. A light evening wind rattled the branches of the maple by his porch. He heated soup, ate it standing at the counter, and was washing the bowl when the phone rang again. "Dad," Rachel said, no preamble, "I went to 4 places. 2 restaurants, a retail store, the grocery. They pay $12 an hour. 13 if you have experience. I have not worked since 2009. We did not plan for this. We never thought—" She cut herself off. He heard the humiliating arithmetic happening in her head. $12 an hour, 40 hours, taxes, gas, groceries, the mortgage looming like a cliff. "Planning," he said, "was always the part that mattered." "I know," she said, and he heard it, finally, the smallest admission. "I did not know how much you were doing. I did not want to know." "You did not need to," Walter said, the edge softening just slightly. "That was the point." "Dad," she said, and he thought she might cry, but she did not. "Can we talk tonight, in person, when Chad is home?" "Tomorrow," he said. He did not trust the late hour or the fragile peace. "We will talk tomorrow." She thanked him, a polite reflex, and hung up. He stood with the phone still to his ear and looked around the kitchen he had kept simple and whole by choice. The refrigerator hummed. The clock over the doorway ticked its honest tick. Night fell in a slow dimming of corners. The streetlights came up, one by one, a soft line of beacons along Brookhaven Drive. Walter went to his study and set his ledger in the drawer, closing it with a quiet click. He sat without turning on the lamp and let his eyes adjust to the gray. He felt, more than thought, the shape of what came next. He would not abandon his grandchildren. He would not pay for their parents' costumes anymore. His phone lit again around 9, Chad's name a white glare against the dark. He let it ring twice, then answered. "You are destroying us," Chad said. No bluster now, only raw anger. "The mortgage company posted a notice. They said if the payment is not made by tomorrow, there is a penalty. If it is not made again, they start the process. Do you hear me? This is real." "It has always been real," Walter said. "Do you think you are teaching us a lesson? Is that what this is? You want to watch us crawl? You want the neighbors to see us fail?" He was breathing hard. "You want to humiliate me." "I want you to build a life you can afford," Walter said. "I want my grandchildren to know their home is paid for by their parents' work, not a secret lifeline from their grandfather. I want my daughter to be able to look in a mirror and recognize herself." "You self-righteous," Chad started, then stopped. When he spoke again, the words were colder. "We will fight you. We will go to court. We will tell people what you are, a man who abandoned his family." "You have been telling people things about me for years," Walter said, and he heard his own voice settle. "You have told them about your promotions and your savvy and your lifestyle. You forgot to tell them who paid for the parts that did not fit your income. You forgot to tell them what $1 million looks like in someone else's handwriting." Chad's breath crackled across the line, furious and helpless. "We will see," he said, and he ended the call. Walter put the phone on the desk and laced his fingers together. He thought of Ethan's straightforward questions, of Lily's small hand in his own at the park last summer, of Rachel's shy, stubborn smile when she was 8, and determined to roller skate without falling. He thought of Evelyn, how she would have watched this unfold without flinching, how she would have straightened the picture frames, and then asked him if he wanted tea. The next morning brought a different rhythm. Walter woke early, made oatmeal, and read the local paper at the table. Halfway down the second page, a notice about a community fundraiser for the library caught his eye. Lily's piano teacher would be performing. He circled the listing with a pen. He would take the children, if circumstances allowed. At 9:47, the phone rang again. Rachel. Her words tumbled out, breathless and wild. "The bank charged a penalty. The car payment bounced, then the insurance. The electric company says, 'Dad, they want deposits now because of the auto pay.' Chad is furious. He tried to make the mortgage payment and realized if he did, we would not have money for groceries or gas. He called the bank back and reversed it. He is blaming you for everything. I went to the academy this morning and they said we owe $4,800 by Friday or the kids are withdrawn. I do not know what to do." Walter pressed his fingers to his brow. The numbers lined themselves up, as they always did. He wanted to hand her a worksheet, a calculator, a pencil. He wanted to say, "Start by listing your actual income." Instead, he said, "You begin by deciding what matters today, not what you wanted yesterday." There was a long pause. He imagined her, standing at the kitchen counter where he had stood so many times, the light slanting across the quartz, the young maple beyond the window tapping against the glass. "We might lose the house," she whispered. The words came out without anger this time, only fear and a dawning clarity. "Dad, I think we are going to lose everything." "Yes," he said quietly, not unkindly. "You probably are." She did not hang up this time. He could hear the soft sounds of a house trying to remain a home, Lily humming to herself upstairs, Ethan opening and closing a cupboard, the dryer buzz in the small room off the hall. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice had changed, as if a long, tight braid had been loosened. "If we lose it," she said, "we start again smaller. If that is what it takes." "That is what it takes," Walter said. After the call, the day moved like slow water. He took a short walk, stopping on his own porch step to tighten a loose rail with a screwdriver. Back inside, he sorted a box of old photographs he had promised himself he would organize. Evelyn holding newborn Rachel in a hospital room lit by afternoon sun. A Christmas morning with paper everywhere, and a young Rachel grinning beside a dollhouse. A picture from a summer barbecue where Chad, then polite and eager, shook his hand with both of his. As evening came on, he stood by the window again. The neighborhood settled into its nightly routine. Porch lights flicked on. A boy on a bicycle made one last loop. Someone's television brightened a front room with the color of a game show. Across the street, the Whitfords' house glowed as well, but the light did not reach the front door. That was where Harold stopped, right at the door. Walter watched him slow his shuffle, lean in toward a paper tacked just above the handle, and read. The older man lifted his cap to scratch his head, then bent closer. A moment later he looked over his shoulder, down the block toward Walter's house, as if he knew he was being watched. Walter stepped back into the dim so Harold would not see him. He did not need to walk over to know what the paper was. He had seen enough of them, over 4 decades of problem-solving, to recognize the sober typeface and the deliberately plain language that could rearrange a life in 30 days. He imagined Rachel finding it, imagined her fingers hesitating at the edge of the tape before she peeled it back. That night, I saw Harold McCoy walking past their house, slowing to read something taped to their front door, and I already knew what it was. By the end of the second week, it wasn't just Rachel and Chad calling me, it was the community calling them out. Walter had been expecting it. Brookhaven was the kind of place where a lawn left unmowed for 2 days became a subject of commentary at the post office, where a new car in a driveway triggered a dozen whispered speculations before Sunday service. People noticed things here. They noticed the absence of Chad's gleaming BMW. They noticed Rachel's quick, tight smile as she passed by with grocery bags. They noticed that the family whose home once radiated comfort now kept their curtains drawn more often than not. He sat on his porch with a mug of tea, the late afternoon sun sharp against the white railing. The maple in the front yard shivered under a cool breeze, scattering a handful of early buds onto the grass. Across the street, Harold McCoy ambled over, a folded newspaper under his arm. Harold wasn't one to mince words, and today was no exception. "You hear what Chad's been saying down at Murphy's?" Harold asked, lowering himself into the chair beside Walter's. "Making it sound like you pulled the rug out from under them for no reason. Says you left them high and dry without warning." Walter took a sip of tea before answering. "Did he also say how much that rug cost over 15 years? Harold chuckled, but his eyes were sharp. "Bill Henderson was there. You remember Bill? Sold Chad that BMW a few years back. Bill asked how Chad managed to afford it on his salary. When Chad started sidestepping, Bill mentioned you co-signed the lease. Bar got real quiet after that." Walter allowed himself the smallest smile. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about the truth standing in daylight for once. "People are starting to ask the right questions," he said. They were. The next day, Mrs. Langford approached him in the cereal aisle at Whitman's Market, her cart half full. "Walter Hensley, I can't believe what I've been hearing," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Cutting off your own daughter in her time of need, what would Evelyn think?" Walter looked her in the eye. "She'd think $976,000. $200 was generous enough." Mrs. Langford blinked, thrown off balance. "What?" "That's how much I've paid toward their mortgage, tuition, cars, insurance, medical bills, vacations, gifts, over 15 years. I have documentation for every cent." A couple pushing a cart nearby slowed, their eyes flicking between the two. Mrs. Langford's face flushed. Rachel mentions what suits her," Walter said evenly, "not necessarily what's true." By the time Walter walked out of the store, word had already begun its quiet migration through Brookhaven's invisible network. 2 days later, he saw Rachel at the grocery store where she had started working. She was behind the register, her blue vest hanging a little loose on her frame, scanning items with brisk efficiency. When she looked up and saw him in her lane, her cheeks colored, but she didn't falter. "Paper or plastic?" she asked the woman in front of him, voice even. Walter stepped aside, not wanting to turn her workday into a public scene. Still, he noticed the way her eyes darted to the clock on the wall, counting the minutes until she could be off her feet. It was the first time in years he'd seen her earning in the literal sense of the word. That evening, Dave Peterson from the hardware store called. You should have heard it, Walt. Chad was at Murphy's again, trying to spin the story. But this time nobody was buying it. He started blaming the economy, then the school's tuition hikes. Harold piped up and said, "Funny how those hikes never stopped you from going on that cruise in 2018? Walter pictured the scene. Chad's jaw tightening, his eyes darting for an ally in the crowd, finding none. That was the difference between gossip and truth. Truth left fewer places to hide. Late in the week, the phone rang again. Rachel. "Dad," she began, but her voice was thinner now, almost frayed. "You're making it impossible to go anywhere without someone having an opinion. People at church. Mrs. Langford, the Hendersons, even the kid's piano teacher. They all have questions." Walter leaned back in his chair, the cord of the phone stretching. "I've answered questions when asked directly. If that makes people uncomfortable, perhaps they should ask why." "You're ruining our reputation," she said, the words trembling between anger and desperation. "I'm not ruining anything," Walter replied. "I'm simply no longer paying for the false one you built." There was a pause on the line, and in that pause, Walter heard the faint shuffle of movement, maybe Rachel turning away from Chad, maybe pressing the phone closer to her ear. "You have no idea what it's like," she said finally, "to have people look at you like you've been lying to them." Walter let the silence stand for a beat. "I think I do," he said, and ended the call. The days were getting longer, but the evenings still carried a chill. Walter found himself on the porch more often, the light from the living room spilling across the boards. He knew the next confrontation was coming. Pride didn't die quietly. He'd see them soon enough, not as hosts behind a polished table, but as people stripped of the comfort his money had bought. When it came, it wouldn't be with pleasantries. When I hung up, I knew the next knock at my door would come from them, and it wouldn't be for pleasantries. They didn't just knock, they stormed in like they still owned my living room. The sound of the front door rattling against its hinges was the first sign. Walter had barely risen from his chair before Chad barreled past him, Rachel following close behind, with a look that was equal parts desperation and embarrassment. The March light through the front windows was pale and cold, painting the room in the kind of brightness that made every shadow sharper. Chad planted himself in the middle of the living room, like a man claiming disputed territory, his jaw tight, his shoulders squared. "This ridiculous stunt ends now," Chad announced. "You're going to call the banks, the school, the insurance companies, every last one of them, and reinstate those payments." Walter closed the door gently, almost in defiance of Chad's entrance, and walked past him to stand beside his desk. "No," he said simply. Rachel stepped forward, her voice softer but trembling. "Dad, please think about what this is doing to Ethan and Lily. The mortgage, the school tuition, these aren't just bills. They're stability for the kids." "I am thinking about them," Walter replied. "That's why I've decided what I have." Chad scoffed, pacing like a caged animal. "You can't just cut us off. There are legal obligations here, verbal contracts. You've been paying for years, there's an expectation." "There's been an expectation," Walter interrupted, "because I allowed it. That ends today." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Rachel looked from her father to her husband, and Walter could see the fear behind her eyes. Fear of losing the roof over their heads. Fear of the lifestyle crumbling. "I will help Ethan and Lily directly," Walter said at last. "Their school, their medical expenses, their clothes, their activities, and I'll set up college funds for both of them. But I will not pay your mortgage. I will not pay for your cars. I will not pay for your insurance or your vacations. Those are yours to handle." Rachel blinked, almost startled by the specificity. You'll still pay for the kids' school?" "Yes," Walter said, "but the payments will go straight to the academy, not through you, not through Chad." Chad stopped pacing and faced him. And what do you expect us to do in the meantime? Downsize to some shoebox apartment? Sell everything? You'll live on what you actually earn, Walter said evenly. That's not realistic, Chad snapped. We have obligations, standards. What you have, Walter cut in, is a choice. Accept the terms or refuse them. But understand this, my offer expires in 48 hours. Rachel's brow furrowed. Expires? Dad, you can't. I can, Walter said. And there's more. He stepped closer, resting one hand on the back of his leather armchair. You will write a letter to the Brookhaven Gazette, acknowledging that for 15 years I've supported your household to the tune of $976,200. You'll thank me publicly for that support. You'll post the same truth on your social media, and you will personally apologize to every neighbor, friend, and family member you've misled these past 2 weeks. Chad's laugh was short and humorless. You're insane if you think I'm going to humiliate myself like that. Then your pride, Walter said calmly, is worth more to you than your children's stability. Rachel's eyes filled, and she reached for Chad's arm. Chad, no, Chad said, pulling away. We don't bow to ultimatums. We're a family, Walter. We work as a team. Teams, Walter replied, require mutual respect. When was the last time either of you thanked me for anything? Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again. Chad's jaw clenched. You have 48 hours, Walter said, glancing at the grandfather clock in the corner. After that, the discussion is over. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. And if we agree? Then your children will have security, Walter said, and we'll rebuild this family on honesty instead of entitlement. Chad turned toward the door without another word. Rachel lingered, her eyes meeting Walter's for a fleeting moment before she followed. The door closed behind them with a dull, final click. Rachel left in tears. Chad left in silence. And somewhere between their house and mine, I knew a war had begun inside their marriage. The letter from the bank wasn't addressed to me, but it landed in my mailbox all the same. I turned the envelope over in my hands, recognizing the Brookhaven First logo in the corner, the same bank where I'd held an account since 1979. It was addressed to Chad and Rachel, yet here it was, tucked in with my electric bill and the weekly grocery circular. A mistake on the mail carrier's part, perhaps, but one I didn't plan to correct right away. For a moment, I stood in the kitchen, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence, and thought about that snowy Christmas 12 years ago when I had driven through an ice storm to deliver their down payment check. That house, the one they'd been so proud to show off, wouldn't have been theirs without me. And now this bank letter, heavy with the scent of trouble, had found its way to my counter. The chapter's purpose was clear in my mind. I needed to confirm what I already suspected. They were in deeper than they had let on, and if the truth was ugly enough, it would become a cornerstone in my plan. Brookhaven's late February air still had a bite when I stepped outside. The sky hung low and gray, threatening rain. My truck rumbled to life, its engine a sound I trusted more than any word Chad had spoken in years. By the time I pulled up in front of the bank's brick facade, the first drops had started to tap against the windshield. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and carpet cleaner greeted me. A young teller with a neat bob and pearl earrings recognized me instantly. "Morning, Mr. Hanlon," she said warmly. "Here to make a deposit?" "Something like that," I replied, placing the envelope on the counter. "This came to me by mistake. Thought I'd deliver it in person. And while I'm here, maybe you can help me with a question." Her eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to me. "Of course." I lowered my voice. "If this account holder's mortgage is in trouble, would there be any public record yet?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "Not public, no. But if it's at a certain stage, there might be notices sent soon. She glanced toward the back offices. If you want to speak with Mr. Reeves, he could check for you. 5 minutes later, I was sitting across from Mr. Reeves, a man I'd known since he was a junior loan officer fresh out of college. He offered a careful smile. Walter, I can't share client information directly, you understand, but if I were to hypothetically confirm that there's a 60-day delinquency and that foreclosure paperwork is in early drafting, that would be strictly off the record. I leaned back in the chair. Hypothetically noted. He tapped a pen against the desk. And hypothetically, there's still time for them to bring it current, but the amount is significant. If they can't cover it, the bank will act before spring. I thanked him, shook his hand, and stepped back into the damp air with the kind of quiet satisfaction that only comes from having a piece of the puzzle slide neatly into place. They weren't just stretched thin, they were hanging by a single thread. That evening, I sat at my desk with a legal pad, drawing up a timeline. Their payment history, their credit dependencies, their reliance on my monthly transfers. I wrote until the lines on the page began to look like a chessboard, every move calculated 3 ahead. The next step was as much about presentation as power. A dinner invite, formal and polite, to be delivered tomorrow morning. The kind of invitation no one could refuse without looking guilty. I picked up the phone and called my oldest friend, Henry, who happened to be the town's most respected estate attorney. I need you at my place Thursday night, I said. Bring the papers we discussed last year. You sure you want to go through with it now? Henry asked. Yes, I said. They've had their warning. Now I want them to have the proof. I hung up, folded the bank envelope back into its original crease, and set it in the center of my desk like a trophy. Outside, the rain had turned steady, drumming on the roof in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. And as I stared at that envelope, I knew exactly how I'd use it to end this on my terms. In the end, what mattered most was not the property, the money, or even the sting of betrayal. It was the truth. The truth that I had given decades of my life, every extra dollar, every ounce of strength, to people who believed they were entitled to it. The truth that I had been taken for granted for far too long. And the truth that I had finally, without apology, drawn a line they could never cross again. Looking back, I can see how each insult, each slight, each manipulative smile was a step toward this moment. For years, I told myself it was just their way, that maybe they didn't realize how much I'd done. But deep down, I knew. They knew. They just didn't care. That was the hardest thing to accept, realizing that love doesn't blind everyone to their own greed. Sometimes it sharpens it. The night I laid out the papers, the room fell silent in a way I'd never heard before. The false charm drained from their faces, replaced by the cold awareness that the tide had turned. All those years of assuming I'd never push back had left them unprepared for the weight of proof, the legal clarity, the unshakable resolve staring back at them. I remember the sound of the clock ticking in the corner, steady and unrelenting. I remember the way their voices faltered as they tried to explain, justify, bargain. And I remember the strange calm that settled over me, not anger, not revenge, but relief. Relief in knowing that I had taken back control of my life without lowering myself to their level. People like them don't believe in consequences until they're standing in the middle of them. They thought arrogance was a shield, that blood ties were a leash I wouldn't dare cut. They learned differently that night. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to threaten. The documents in front of them spoke louder than anything I could say. I've come to realize that boundaries are not just for strangers or acquaintances, they're most necessary with the people closest to you. Family can love you, but they can also drain you. Respect is not automatic. It has to be earned. And once it's broken, it takes more than words to restore. When they left that evening, they didn't slam the door. They didn't make a scene. They walked out quietly, each carrying their own version of the truth, but all of them knowing that the balance had shifted forever. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. No angry calls, no sudden reconciliations, just a space that I hadn't had in years, a space where my time, my money, and my peace belonged to me again. I filled it slowly, not with things, but with people who had proven they deserved a place in my life. Neighbors who had stood by me, friends who remembered my birthdays without being reminded, folks who didn't measure my worth by what I could give them. The air felt lighter. My home, though the same in structure, felt different too, warmer, freer, more mine than it had in decades. I learned that protecting your peace is not selfish, it's survival. That saying no is not cruelty, it's clarity. And that sometimes the only way to teach respect is to stop giving someone the power to disrespect you. I don't know what they tell people now. Maybe they spin it to make me look like the cold one. Maybe they admit what they did. It doesn't matter. The truth is in my hands, my files, my choices. I don't need their version to survive. If I could go back, I wouldn't change the years I gave. Those sacrifices shaped me. They taught me patience, resilience, and the quiet strength to endure. But I would change the way I valued myself. I would have drawn the line sooner. Because here's the thing, your worth is not up for negotiation. No one gets to decide that you've given enough, but should give more. No one gets to rewrite the terms of your love to suit their convenience. I keep that philosophy close now. Once you've shown me who you are, I'll believe you, and I'll act accordingly. So I close this chapter not with bitterness, but with a kind of hard-earned peace. They taught me the cost of letting arrogance go unchecked. I taught them the cost of underestimating me. And if you've ever felt the sting of being taken for granted, remember your silence is not weakness, your boundaries are not cruelty, and your decision to walk away may be the most loving thing you ever do for yourself. If you like this story, then leave the number 1 in the comments and subscribe to our channel to hear the next story.